Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Connecticut's Old State House. I'm Sally Whipple, and I have the pleasure of being the executive director here and welcoming you. As many of you know, our monthly conversations at noon begin with a peek into Connecticut's history through the eyes of a historian, and then move into a panel discussion that blends history and current issues and insights. Diane Smith, the Connecticut Network's senior producer for program development, moderates the discussions and brings you into the conversation through questions and answers. These programs are generously supported by a grant from Connecticut Humanities, and today's program is produced in partnership with our friends at the Connecticut World War I Centennial Committee, represented here by Christine Pitsley. As you may know, our programs this year support a specific theme, choosing to participate. They focus on different ways that Connecticut residents have engaged in civic life in the past and how we can engage today. The theme stems from a recent report published by the Secretary of the State's Office and its partners, the 2016 Connecticut Civic Health Index Report, which you can find online. Now, with a name like Connecticut Civic Health Index Report, it does not sound exciting. But it is exciting. It's a really nice profile about how people in Connecticut are engaged in their communities and in their government today. So I'd recommend taking a look at it. It also has ideas for actions that you can take to be more involved in Connecticut's civic health. And you can simply Google Connecticut Civic Health Index Report and you'll find it. The report tells us how healthy Connecticut is, provides us with ideas for making Connecticut healthier. And of course, one way to participate in civic life is to volunteer. And that is our focus today. We're going to be talking about World War I and volunteerism. And so, of course, because volunteerism is the theme, we will be very happy if you volunteer to fill out the program survey on your chairs today and let us know how things are going so that we can get new ideas for programs and improve the programs every month. It would be a great help. And now I would like to introduce Diane Smith to start the program.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you for turning out in the rain today. It's nice to have all of you here. The title of our program today is Volunteer for Victory, Connecticut Women in World War I. We're going to look at a variety of ways women were involved in the war effort, many of them as volunteers. Just to refresh your memory a little bit, World War I raged across the globe from 1914 through 1918. It was known different ways as the Great War, sometimes called the War to End All War. The international conflict involved most of Europe, along with Russia, the United States, and the Middle East. Many people thought that the war was going to end quickly, but the fighting continued for 4 years, leaving untold carnage and destruction in its wake. This was the theater into which Connecticut's women physicians sought to serve their country and alleviate suffering among both combatants and civilians. These women would not win the right to vote for 2 years after the war ended, yet their patriotism led them to step into the fray. With the tremendous need for medical care, these female doctors were embraced by the U.S. military, right? Not exactly. World War I became a battleground of sorts for these brave doctors as they fought to take their place alongside their male colleagues. How successful were they? How did their wartime service affect their place in the medical community following the armistice are some of the questions we're going to look at. How did other Connecticut women contribute to the war effort, and how did their work change society's view of the role of women? We'll talk about that in just a little while. But our first speaker today is Dr. Heather Munro Prescott, a professor of history at Central Connecticut State University. She is the author of numerous books and articles on various aspects of the history of women's health, including most recently, The Morning After, A History of Emergency Contraception in the United States. Please welcome our speaker.
Thanks for that lovely introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, sound good? All right, so what I want to do today is use the First World War as a case study of how women in Connecticut and nationally used voluntary organizations to advance their own professional issues as well as humanitarian issues during wartime. So I start with a quote from Emily Dunning Barringer, who is in the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame, but spent much of her career in New York State, so she has kind of a dual identity in terms of her regional origins. So in 1918, Emily Dunning Barringer, who was then president of the Medical Women's Society of New York State, declared, "The war has pushed the cause of the woman physician ahead many years. In a twinkling, so to speak, opportunity for development may and will come, which in ordinary progress of events would have taken long years of hard work to bring about." So, as this quote suggests, the war came at a critical period for medical women in the United States. During the 19th century, women physicians had carved out a niche for themselves by proclaiming that they had an innate sympathy toward the sick, female skills of nurturing, and were particularly suited to the care of women and children and various family members. But by the early 20th century, medical women were increasingly aligning themselves with the professional norms of male physicians, which emphasized rational, objective, scientific medical care over the traditionally feminine ethic of sympathy towards the sick. So for women physicians who were trying to enter the male-dominated profession and seek the same kind of recognition that male doctors received, the war seemed like the perfect opportunity to further integrate themselves into the medical profession and demonstrate their mettle to their male colleagues. Unfortunately, however, male physicians were not willing to accept women as equal participants in the war effort. The Owen-Dyer bill, passed by Congress in July 1918, gave members of the medical corps the same rank as other military officers. And during the Civil War and the Spanish-American War, doctors had fought for the same rank as other officers. However, the military refused to give women physicians the same opportunity, largely due to opposition from male physicians and the American Medical Association, among other organizations. The military claimed that since most women physicians cared for children and female patients, they were unsuited for military medicine. The military grudgingly offered women physicians positions as so-called contract surgeons, that is, civilian consultants who served on a contract, usually a month-to-month or maybe a several-month contract, but they did not receive the benefits of military rank, pay, or status, nor did they receive a pension once they left the military. Now, these were the same terms that women physicians had served under during the Civil War and the Spanish-American War. And for some women physicians, this was sufficient. About 2,200 out of the more than 6,000 women physicians in the United States registered with the Volunteer Medical Service Corps to serve on call for war relief work. So nationwide, 2,200 registered as contract surgeons, and only about 100 wound up serving. Connecticut only had about 27 women licensed to practice medicine in the state at the time of the First World War. So none of the women physicians in Connecticut actually served as contract surgeons. Instead, they served along with other women physicians who felt that contract service was a separate and unequal status for women, partly because it meant giving up their practices in the United States, and no rank, no promotion while in service, no bonuses or pensions when they left service, and no disability compensation if they were injured, and so forth. So rather than submit themselves to male authority, women physicians decided to volunteer with various volunteer organizations in Europe, including the Red Cross and something called women's hospitals, which I will mention in a minute. So by the time of the armistice, there were at least 76 medical women from around the United States serving for various NGOs, non-governmental organizations, during the war. Connecticut only had 27 female physicians who were licensed to practice. There were dozens of other women who had medical degrees who either decided not to practice, had left practice, had let their licenses expire, and so forth. So Connecticut did not have a lot of women physicians, but we made up for that by percentage-wise, Connecticut women were actually overrepresented among the volunteers who served. So two of the women physicians who served with the Red Cross were Arley, Munson, Hare, who you see pictured here, and Jessie Fisher, who I will mention in a moment. Hare was born in Bridgeport in 1871, attended Cornell University. So Cornell University was one of the first co-ed universities in the country, and I'm proud to say I hail from Cornell University. She received her medical degree from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania in 1902. Hare spent her early postgraduate days working as a medical missionary in India, which she described in her memoir, Jungle Days, which came out in 1913. During the mid-19-teens, so shortly before the war, U.S. entered the war, Hare returned to the United States and began working as a postgraduate, what we would now call a resident, at a hospital in Red Bank, New Jersey. And she took the place of a male physician who had been called overseas. In 1918, Dr. Hare volunteered for services overseas herself, and she worked as a serologist and bacteriologist at Red Cross Hospital No. 2 in Paris. And for her service, she received the Honor Medal for Courage and Devotion from the French government. I should mention that Emily Dunning Barringer got a medal from the leader of Serbia, president of Serbia at the time. So these women were well decorated for their service. Jessie Fisher served as a pathologist working on gas gangrene for the American Red Cross in Beauvais, France. Prior to the war, Fisher had worked with male colleagues at Connecticut Hospital for the Insane, now Connecticut Valley Hospital, and then later Middlesex Hospital. Fisher volunteered to serve overseas with the Red Cross despite being married with a teenage son. In her diary and letters, she mentioned she didn't like housework. So apparently her husband did, so he let her go work for the Red Cross. And I imagine since they were both physicians, they hired servants. So she didn't have to do housework. Not long after her arrival in France in April of 1918, Fisher wrote in her diary that while she and the other women physicians were welcomed by the French people, they were not so welcomed by American servicemen. She wrote, "Sometimes a soldier or officer salutes me. Evidently, our women MDs' status is not established." In a letter to a female colleague back in the United States, Fisher recounted the humiliating experiences of American women physicians serving in France. Quote, "We are not saluted, nor have we any authority. Although some of the older men were as courteous as at home, younger men were not so kind," she wrote. Fisher confided she had struck a young U.S. Army Medical Corps lieutenant who made me feel my lack of rank, and she also lamented that soldiers do not have the proper respect for us. The French officers often mistook the women physicians for Army chauffeurs, that is, ambulance drivers. Fisher's advised her friends and all women MDs to, quote, "stay in the U.S. and fight for commissions for the women. They need us badly, and if the women will refuse to come without commissions, they will be compelled to give them to us," end quote. 38 years after her war service, her experience still stung. In an alumni survey conducted by Women's Medical College of Philadelphia, Fisher wrote, quote, "Never, except in France during World War I, was there any discrimination because I was female," end quote. So Fisher's experience as a woman physician in Connecticut was pretty typical. The small numbers, I think, and the fact that many women practiced in community hospitals or in private practice meant they were well integrated into the profession. In other words, there weren't a large number of them to pose a threat to male doctors, and so in general, women physicians, at least in the early 20th century, were well regarded. So rather than being subordinated to male supervision, other women physicians decided to create their own all-woman medical units overseas. And creating all-women organizations was a continuation of earlier professional strategies for women physicians. Women, when excluded from male medical societies, created their own organizations. When excluded from all-male medical colleges, women created their own medical colleges, such as the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. and other organizations for women. In 1917, the War Committee of the Medical Women's National Association established American Women's Hospitals to provide medical care to both the military and civilians in war-torn areas of Allied countries. So the War Committee for the Women's National Association actually started to form before the U.S. entered the First World War, and women physicians were interested in helping out soldiers and civilians who were in the war-torn countries even prior to the war effort. Dr. Rosalie Slaughter Morton of Virginia served as chair of the organization, with Emily Dunning Barringer serving as vice chair. In an article from the Forum magazine entitled Battalion of Life, Morton said that the American Women's Hospitals was, quote, impelled by the same overwhelming impulse for service and sacrifice which stirred the famous Battalion of Death, the all-female unit of Russian women who leapt to the defense of their country. So the American Women's Hospitals are the Battalion of Life. The Russian women are the Battalion of Death. They dressed in male uniforms and shaved their heads and were these fighting, strong women. So in counterpoint, the American Women's Hospitals are the Battalion of Life, but they're still strong women. So according to Morton, the women physicians and surgeons of many lands are making a stand no less soldierly and grim against the ghastly specters of injury, disease, ravage, and starvation which throng upon the heels of war. The American Women's Hospitals took their name from the Scottish Women's Hospitals, which had been organized in October of 1914 and soon deployed to war-torn Belgium, Serbia, and France. Initially, the American Women's Hospitals served as a clearinghouse for women physicians traveling to Europe to work for the Red Cross, but soon the organization was running its own medical facilities in countries devastated by the war. The first American Women's Hospital was set up in the village of Neufmoutier, Seine-et-Marne, in July 1918, and relocated to the town of Luzancy a month later. The hospital was run and staffed entirely by women physicians, nurses, chauffeurs, and volunteers. The plan was to have women physicians provide medical care to members of the military without having to place themselves under the direct authority of men from either the United States or the French armed forces. Between the opening of Hospital Number 1 in August of 1918 and its closing in March of 1919, the staff treated 420 hospital cases, 254 surgical cases, and 472 dental cases. So this is truly a multi-specialty facility. Of the 14 physicians who worked at Hospital Number 1, 3 have Connecticut ties. So Connecticut really stepped up. Ier Jay Manwaring from Norwich, and Mary McLaughlin and Mary Louise Evans from Middletown. These women were part of the second unit of physicians, nurses, and chauffeurs deployed to the Luzancy Hospital. And so here we have a photograph of the the second team of physicians and other support staff sent to Hospital Number 1. These photographs that I'm about to show you were taken by the hospital director, Louise Hare, and were meant to generate what she called picturesque publicity for the hospital and the American Women's Hospitals as a whole. So these photographs were meant to publicize the efforts of American Women's Hospitals overseas among people in the United States. So all 3 of the women physicians who served from Connecticut who served in the American Women's Hospitals were graduates of the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. Their gynecology professor, Dr. Caroline Purnell, was director of the American Women's Hospital Committee for Foreign Service and probably most likely influenced their decision to join. I don't think it's an accident that a lot of the women who served came from American Women's Hospitals, came from the Medical College of Pennsylvania. So Evans and McLaughlin were both assistant physicians at Connecticut Hospital for the Insane, so they also had ties with Jessie Fisher. So here's some photographs of some of these individuals. Ier Manwaring, who's in the center of this photograph, was one of the first women doctors to practice in Norwich. From 1917 to 1918, she had served as the physician for students at Connecticut College. And after the United States entered the war, she first served on the Connecticut division of the Council of National Defense and helped raise $5,000 towards Connecticut's contribution towards the money to fund the American Women's Hospitals. In July of 1918, Manwaring applied to work in the overseas hospitals and was put in charge of the dispensary department of Hospital Number 1. She got glowing recommendations from the president of Connecticut College. I've just gotten the time, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to speed this up a little bit. A letter written to the director of American Women's Hospital said, Dr. Manwaring came in last night, tired but contented, with 65 patients in a radius of 30 miles to her credit. So as dispensary director, she would go out and do home visits of people in the community, and it's clear that she worked very hard. And here she is returning with a patient to Hospital Number 1 with a couple of nurses and the chauffeur to the right. So the work of American Women's Hospitals continued even after armistice was declared. The invading armies had left behind an undernourished civilian population and unsanitary conditions that led to epidemics of typhoid fever, diphtheria, and scarlet fever, and then on top of all of that, the influenza pandemic. So there definitely was a public health crisis after wartime. This is very typical. The physicians and staff of Hospital Number 1 received countless letters of thanks from local residents. One French woman described the lady doctors as angels of France, who miraculously delivered her and the residents of the village from a deadly typhoid epidemic. According to an article in the Hartford Courant, the hospital staff became so well respected that local residents insisted on being taken to their hospital and were upset when the French government decided to relocate the hospital to a different part of the country. In April of 1919, the physicians, nurses, and ambulance drivers of Luzancy Hospital were awarded honorary French citizenship and received a decoration from the French government equivalent to the Legion of Honor. In typical modest fashion, Dr. Manwaring wrote in a letter to the Norwich Bulletin, "Please don't think I'm bragging. I really don't deserve mine, but I love it just the same." So women physicians hoped that their war work and the passage of women's suffrage, many of these women actually were involved in the suffrage movement, so there's some overlap between women physicians' activism and the suffrage movement that was going on simultaneously. And they hoped that their volunteerism during the war, the suffrage movement would advance the cause of women physicians. And the women physicians I've mentioned in this talk returned to successful practices in Connecticut once the war was over. But the hopes that the war effort would advance the cause of women physicians as a whole was soon dashed, and things went not only back to normal as President Harding declared, but things actually went backward for women physicians for quite some time, and the percentage of women in the medical profession actually declined. It would take another global conflict for women physicians to receive the status in the U.S. military they deserved. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like the panelists to join us now. We'll continue our conversation. That was terrific. Thank you. And I thought the pictures were great. Weren't they wonderful? Wow. It's hard to believe it wasn't all that long ago when you look at the pictures and see what they were working with. Very interesting. Okay, so joining us now for the panel discussion, and by the way, if you haven't been here before, I should tell you that we'd love it if you would get involved. Raise your hand and I'll call on you if you have a question or comment for the panelists. So joining us now is David Drury, who's been a working journalist for 37 years. He retired as an editor of the Hartford Courant and contributes regularly to the newspaper and to its website. He majored in modern European history at the University of Virginia and continued then with his graduate study at University of North Carolina. He calls himself a lifelong student of history, and he's written on various topics of interest for the Courant and for ConnecticutHistory.org. And by the way, his book, Hartford in World War I, is for sale in our store or shop, which is just right across the hallway there. So I encourage you to come in, take a look at the book. So thank you for coming, David. And Katie Zahara is here. Hello, Katie. She works in client onboarding and service at Cigna. She has a diverse professional and volunteering background. For 5 years, Katie served as director of choirs at Simsbury High School. She taught 6 different choirs there, and I keep track of 6 different ones. She also served as a youth group coordinator for First Congregational Church of West Hartford, where she guided the youth groups through many different volunteer opportunities. Currently, Katie volunteers with several groups at Cigna, and her passion right now is volunteering with the Emerging Leaders Society at United Way. So we're going to have you talk to us a little bit about volunteering today, and thank you so much for joining us. David, let me start with you because I'm interested in how or if women from the U.S. and maybe from Connecticut, how were they involved before the U.S. got into the war, or were they?
Yes, they were. And it's interesting, in 1914, the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association was very active. It was headed by Katharine Hepburn's mother, Katharine Horton Hepburn, and they had, in May of 1914, what was described as the largest parade ever in Hartford involving women in Hartford's history. And they were very active and remained active, although the government at the time under Marcus Holcomb, the governor, was opposed to suffrage. But one of the first things that did happen after the United States entered the war in April 1917 was the Suffrage Association basically pledged their support for the war effort, and were very instrumental in, like a lot of women's groups, in drumming up both patriotic support and certainly with volunteer organizations like the Red Cross and the YWCA and the Salvation Army, all were involved. So.
David, tell me a little bit about how those organizations were part of the war effort and what women actually did for those organizations.
A multitude of tasks, Diane. The Red Cross in particular, both on the home front and overseas, did everything from knit sweaters and socks for the doughboys. There were Red Cross volunteers who went to France. In the book, I quoted from the diary of Dorothy Cheney from the Cheney Mills family in Manchester, who was a Red Cross volunteer, was serving in a Red Cross hospital in Paris that was under bombardment from the big German gun known as Big Bertha during the March and April German offensive, and then went on to serve as basically in a hospital that treated American servicemen who were victim by the flu, the Spanish influenza. And she was not a nurse by training. She became a nurse's aide, but was basically left in charge of 2 floors of the entire hospital because they were so short-staffed. And she wrote about this, and really some of her narrative, just the awful situations in which the flu would just claim victims overnight.
We'll talk a little bit more about some of the things that were happening here, but Heather, it's interesting that David points out that this one woman who was not even originally a nurse takes over 2 floors of a hospital, and yet here were all these women doctors who wanted to be there.
Right. It's a very sad waste of talent, and it was. This was true of other women who sought to serve. Women nurses did not receive officer status during the First World War, so that was consideration for some women who entered. Many of the nurses, in fact, volunteered for the Red Cross, so there's far more nurses working for NGOs than for the U.S. military. Women who wanted to enlist in the Navy or had to have higher qualifications than men. So there are far more women who could have served had their talents been recognized. And the United States, I think, really suffered as a result of sexism. Not just the women who were denied their status, but the U.S. military and the civil defense organizations in the United States suffered because of sexual barriers.
I believe you told me at one point that a number of the women physicians in Connecticut, or at least a handful, were married to physicians, and when the men went off to war, the women took over their practices, and
That's
sometimes
true.
other practices.
Part of the reason that not very many women came from Connecticut is that there just weren't that many women physicians. Many of them were married to physicians themselves. It wasn't unusual for women to come to the state and meet men as a result of serving in hospitals around the state. So they would do their practice and their husband's practice, or women physicians would take the place of another male physician who had been deployed overseas. So there was a tremendous shortage of medical personnel in the United States. And when the influenza pandemic hit Connecticut, and hit Connecticut very hard, particularly Norwich and Bridgeport, other places where there was a lot of either troops are being deployed, returning, or manufacturing, and so forth. There was just a shortage of people to help out, and men, women, whatever. So,
David, how does that story about the flu, you're nodding your head as she's talking, how does that story about the flu sort of resonate through what's happening back at home in Connecticut?
Dr. Prescott is right. I mean, the flu hit Connecticut very hard. In fact, the Army cantonments, the camps overseas in this country, the nearest one being in Camp Devens in Massachusetts, at one point had to put out a call for volunteers, and volunteers from the Hartford area had to come up, to help with nursing. And this is pretty much true throughout the country.
David, there are some other ways that women got involved in the war effort who were not doctors, women who stayed at home, maybe never had been employed at all. Some of them went right into the factories, which, I always think about Rosie the Riveter, right? That's the image people have. But actually, women were being employed in Connecticut during the First World War.
Very much so. The thing to keep in mind about the First World War was, like the Civil War to a certain degree, and certainly like World War II, this was total war. The United States was only as a belligerent in the First World War for 18 or 19 months. But at that time, all of the society was organized for the war effort. So this part of the rationale for, obviously Connecticut at that time was a great supplier of munitions and guns. According to the governor, 54% of the nation's munitions and guns were produced in Connecticut in 1917. You had tremendous demand for manpower to go overseas, and to fill those jobs, a lot of companies who had never hired women before had to put women in the factories, and they performed very well. In fact, female workers in Connecticut factories doubled between the years of 1913 and 1919. And to accommodate women, a lot of companies did things that they'd never done before, like start daycare centers, child cares, nurseries. So it was pretty much unprecedented.
That's really advanced thinking, I think, to make it that possible. But as you said, it's an all-war mentality. Everyone is involved in the effort. Then there were women who didn't go to work, but who volunteered to do other things. Like, I think the old State House was actually involved in part of the war effort.
It was a focal point of the states and the city's war effort, because right outside the old State House was built the Liberty Bond Cottage. And the main official for the state of Connecticut for raising Liberty bonds, which was how the war was primarily funded, either through bonds or war stamps, was the wife of Morgan Bulkley, Fanny Bulkley. And she was appointed by the U.S. Treasury to head the bond efforts. And her and the wife of Richard Bissell, who headed the State Council of Defense, Marie Bissell, were very instrumental in the bond drives, there were 5 of them, counting the victory drive. They even, aside from the cottage out front, they were coordinated bond sales that actually went into department stores like Sage Allen, and it would encourage women who would go in to do their shopping to, buy your merchandise, and, oh, by the way, pick up a bond while you're here as well. So.
Interesting. Katie, one of the things that we were talking about is that these women, and in particular the women physicians who volunteered to go overseas and put themselves in harm's way, wouldn't even be able to vote for another 2 years after the war ends. How does that strike you as a young woman and a person who's really involved in volunteering?
So, that's absolutely amazing to me. Every time I hear a fact like that, I'm constantly floored by how far we have come in such a relatively short amount of time. To me, in the many volunteer efforts that I'm a part of, women are everywhere. Even the company I work for, Cygnus, over 70% of our workforce is female. So it's just amazing to me to hear something like that, to think that here were women proving all along such wonderful value, such intelligence, such bravery that they have, and to not even be able to have a basic right like that to vote it's amazing. And it makes me so thankful for how far we've come while still remembering, how far we have to go still today.
If anybody has questions or comments, please raise your hand and we'll come to you with a microphone so that you can join in. Just try to get my attention. Okay, right there.
What, 21 at that time?
The age, it was 21, but it was only for men.
But when they were allowed to vote, then it became 21.
Yeah. But that wouldn't be until 1920, so, yeah.
Thank you.
David, you were talking about the suffrage movement and how it tied in with the war. I'm guessing that it kind of took a back seat, though, to the rest of the war effort.
It did. It was basically kind of put on hold during the period of belligerency. And actually, in Connecticut, women voted in the 1920 presidential election, but I don't think Connecticut had yet passed its own suffrage bill at that time. It was
Connecticut ratified the 19th Amendment after Tennessee did.
Yeah.
So it's not like we missed the boat. It's just sort of kind of put a official stamp on the suffrage. There were some suffragists in Connecticut who continued during the war effort, and some of them did see the war as their opportunity, like women physicians, to prove that they were deserving of full citizenship. But in general, much of the effort of women who had been involved in the suffrage movement was devoted to the war effort. But it was strategic to demonstrate their worthiness.
It's interesting, though, that, and I'm sort of sad at the end of your talk when you said for the physicians, they came back and really nothing had changed for them.
Right, and for Connecticut women, Jessie Fisher is a good example. They felt like that they weren't discriminated against that much. My colleague Toby Appel at Yale is working on larger project on Connecticut women physicians going back to the 1870s, and I think partly because there weren't a lot of women physicians in Connecticut, and because they were in private practice or well integrated, or in areas that were considered appropriate for women physicians, that they didn't pose as much of a threat to men in the profession. So there wasn't as much sexism in Connecticut. But once they went overseas, so when they went overseas and faced discrimination from male physicians overseas, that was kind of like an eye-opener. So I think, so things didn't change much for women physicians from Connecticut who went back. They went back generally to successful practices of various sorts. And Dr. Manwaring, I think, was quite affluent by the time she passed away, because she gave away land and donated to a number of worthy causes. So she never married or had children, but still, she seems to have been very successful financially. But for women physicians in general around the nation, things got worse. And women's, some medical colleges went co-ed, but they established quotas on women. Meanwhile, some women's medical colleges couldn't stay in business, and so the kind of this opening that had come in the 19th century for women as healers and nurturers kind of closed after 1920, and so the percentage of women in the medical profession actually went down until the 70s, really.
David, we talked about some of the things that women were doing, but even women who never left the home and also didn't sell war bonds, they were doing things too, because everybody was expected to contribute to the war effort, every family.
Much of the state's publicity machinery, which became awesome during the First World War, was aimed at the housewife, because it was the housewife who had to conserve food, who had to ration fuel. Women were encouraged to sign a pledge that they would not use meat or wheat flour on certain days, that they would. A number of women actually volunteered to work in the farms, because Connecticut's economy at that time was heavily industrialized and factory dominated, and with the need for manpower, the farmers needed help, and there were actually women who volunteered as what was known as farmerettes to go out and work in the factory.
Land Army.
Yeah, that was the
Women's Land Army.
That was the official
Okay.
title.
Yeah.
And yes, at all levels, women were pretty critical to the war effort.
Katie, what we're hearing here is partially how a big worldwide, world war that enveloped this country toward the end, but still, really influenced people in going out to volunteer. What gets people out volunteering today, particularly people in your generation?
I think a desire to connect. More and more, there's a distance between physical human beings as, every day in our jobs, we're using the computer at home, we're on our phones, we're watching the TV, going on a Netflix binge. So there's a million different reasons why we're not interacting as much, and I think people, especially, my generation, 20s, 30s, we get to a point where we realize, hey, I'm not really making connections outside of my work team that I'm seeing every day. And we get to this moment where we decide, I want to do something else, and I would like for it to be something that's productive for the world around me. And I find that more and more fellow young professionals are getting to that point where they're realizing, I want to meet people outside of the sort of bubble that I'm in my current workspace. And it's been great to see. I think people are really connecting. There's so many different avenues through which people can volunteer these days. Thanks to the technology, the same technology that builds these walls also allows us access to so many different organizations, especially locally. There's such a focus on helping your local community, and through social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, we're able to really connect with organizations that kind of fit the work that we hope to do and the things that are important to us.
Katie, tell us a little bit about the Emerging Leaders Society.
Sure, so the Emerging Leaders Society is what's called an affinity group of United Way. They have another affinity group called the Women's Leadership Council, but Emerging Leaders Society is a group for people ages 21 to 40. The focus is on young professionals, but they're from all different fields. There's teachers, there's artists, there's people who work in insurance, such as myself. But it's a great group in that we try to keep our activities very diverse. So today's young professional, when we are dedicating our time to an organization, we not only want it to be impacting our local community, but it's always nice to have sort of an extra development opportunity. So I feel like a lot of my generation is very focused on development opportunities, gaining new skills, gaining new insights, hearing from different organizations. So through the Emerging Leaders Society, we not only go into some of the Hartford public schools and work with students, we do that about twice per month, but we also hear from local experts. For example, we have an upcoming series on gender in the workplace and communication between genders in the workplace and how that impacts the work we do and the culture. We also have just happy hours where we get together and connect with people who you would never meet in any other
volunteer
circumstance.
for that one.
Yeah, I'm always at those. But I mean, the point is it's a variety of activities. It's not just, we're going to do this one activity every single month. It's the same every time. It's how can we turn volunteerism and make it into something that's multifaceted, that has multiple benefits and not just one benefit. Not just I feel good at the end of the day because I've helped someone, but look, I'm meeting all these new people. I'm getting a chance to try out some leadership skills that maybe I don't get to work on in my job.
Well, I think that's interesting, David, that Katie mentions that millennials maybe are looking for development opportunities as part of their volunteer effort, because that makes me think about all these women who got out there and did all of the various things that we've discussed and more during the war. And then what happens when it's over? Do they just go back home and they leave the factory? They leave, they've learned how to go out and sell war bonds. They've been leaders in many ways. What happens afterwards?
Many did exactly what you just described, yes. And I also might mention too, I know Dr. Prescott mentioned the doctors. There were other women in the military service, and there was the Navy actually started enlisting, and women from Connecticut enlisted in the naval militia, which became known as yeomen, and some were based down on the shoreline. And one of the more famous units was the Signal Corps in the Army started a training program to operate switchboards in France. So the young women had to be both bilingual, French and English speaking, and they became known as the Hello Girls, and they performed very heroically, although their service wasn't really recognized until, 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah, they didn't receive military
Yeah.
When would that happen for women? When would they, by World War II, I presume they were getting benefits that the men were getting?
During World War II, Congress finally passed a bill and President Roosevelt signed a bill that allowed women physicians to get commissions as officers, and nurses were also given officer status during the Second World War. So there was an expansion of military opportunities for women, and that actually kind of gave a permanent position for women as careers in the military, not just emergency personnel hired for a particular conflict. Getting back to the question about what did women do after the war, there were some women who were active in voluntary organizations, the women's suffrage movement being the most notable, but other organizations before the war, and that type of activism continued. And once women got the right to vote, they created the League of Women Voters, and they were very active during the war, even in Americanization programs and voter education, civic, you know, teaching students about civics and things like that. So there was some momentum, but career-wise, yeah, a lot of women went back into the home. But it doesn't mean that they weren't active. I mean, we tend to think of housewives as being passive and all they do is do housework. If women had enough leisure time, and that's kind of like the if, you know, women with servants tended to have more leisure time, or more affluent women had more leisure time, women would get involved in various service organizations like what we see today. So.
David, you just mentioned women who were involved in the military outside of medical corps. Was their service noted? Were they decorated? Did they get medals?
Actually, one of my favorite stories that I included in the book was of a Hartford nurse named Ruth Hovey. She was trained at Presbyterian Hospital in New York. She was lived on Prospect Street here in Hartford. And she enlisted during the war, but was initially assigned to the British Expeditionary Forces, where she stayed there for about a year. Then she transferred over to the AEF,
Which is?
American Expeditionary Force, in May or June of 1918. In July of 1918, and this was during the period of the Second Battle of the Marne, which was basically one of the pivotal engagements of the war. After a series of German attacks were halted, the French, General Marshal Foch led the French army, which the American divisions were then attached to the French army, into a massive counterattack. And she found herself with a surgical headquarters unit along the fighting lines. And all of us are familiar with the TV show MASH, and her experience was exactly like the TV show MASH, because her and the other nurses came out of their dugouts, as the casualties are coming in. They operated for over 24 hours with shells literally going. She wrote about this in a letter to her mother, and it's all in a document that's over at the State Library. Literally, shrapnel was going over the nurses and the doctors' heads.
That's not a letter a mother wants to get.
The roof was blown off well, she let her mother know she was okay.
Well, I guess that's true, yeah.
But in answer to your question, she was under fire for a couple of days. The unit relocated. She was again under fire, and ultimately she was awarded a Bronze Star and the Croix de Guerre for her heroism. And
interesting. We talked just briefly about accommodations that were made at some of the larger employers, some of the factories, so that women could work, things like daycare centers. What happened after the war? Did all that disappear?
Well, I don't really know. I mean, I certainly, the factory employment was cut back considerably, but it was not just women, it was men as well, because the production just wasn't needed any longer.
Right, because of so much production involved munitions. But
there were certain employers in Hartford, such as Royal Typewriter and Underwood Typewriter, that always hired quite a few women, and their production probably stayed at a reasonable level. So
I know during World War II, a number of manufacturers in the state actually transitioned from what their major line of products was into something that supported the war effort. Did that also happen in World War I?
Well, it was more of a question of transitioning into the war effort for a lot of firms like Pratt Whitney. I mean, it was not just the fact that Connecticut had Colts and Remington and Winchester and these major munitions manufacturers, but all the tool and die industries in Connecticut were able to basically retool some of their equipment and start turning out shells and fuses and things like that. And one thing worth noting is factories for both men and women sometimes weren't very safe. And there was
thinking about Ensign Bickford.
There was an explosion at Ensign Bickford
during World War I.
World War I, right after the armistice, but was still when production was still going full speed. In which 2 young women were actually killed, and they were in the process of making hand grenades. So.
Wow. Again, if you have any questions, please raise your hand.
I have a question for Katie. Somebody mentioned earlier that more women could have served had their talents and skills been recognized. And I see a lot of boards for nonprofits that would like to have people in their 20s and 30s on their boards, and I hear from people in their 20s and 30s that they would like to serve on boards. Do you have advice for more effective matchmaking so that we on boards can make better use of talents and skills that people have?
I think one thing people can do is reach out to companies and try to form a connection there. A lot of companies, especially in the Hartford area, have what they call leadership development programs. I know, at my workplace, we have probably 5 or 6 of them, and most of those people are in that 20 to 30-year age range. They're people who are typically, your overachiever types, if you will, who are exactly the type of people who you want to be on your boards because you'll know they'll be active. So I think that's a great place to start. Another great thing, particularly in the Hartford area, we have Emerging Leader Society, we have HYPE, the Hartford Young Professionals, I forget what the E stands for, but we have several different young professionals organizations that are active, and I think it's a matter of reaching out and really being aware of what's out there. I think now these days, especially in Hartford, we're getting better and better at promoting these wonderful organizations that are happening. We're trying to establish more presence. I know for ELS, I'm on the Marketing and Communications Committee, and our big charge this year is make it so that people know what Emerging Leader Society is, because we've been around for 5 years and not a lot of people have ever heard of us. And so I think as these organizations are getting better at marketing ourselves on social media and being out in the community, I think it will eventually become easier for different nonprofit organizations to find this wonderful pool of resources of people in the 20 to 30-year age range who want to serve on boards and who have the skills and the drive to really be very passionate about serving on a board too.
Katie, you mentioned something prior to the program to me that I found very interesting, which is that many of these young professionals or young people who are volunteering tend to get overcommitted, and that this goes back to an earlier stage in their lives. Why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, so I mean, and I'm sure it's true for many generations, but I feel that I've seen, especially through my teaching experience, a real shift start to happen where it's not enough to go to school and do well. It's not enough to have an A and be on the honor roll. It's not enough to just volunteer for an organization. It's not enough to be just on a sports team. Kids these days are so overcommitted, and I've seen, even since my time in the schools, the commitments that these children are making are incredible. I mean, children who are in 3rd and 4th grade who have dance class, they have choir, they have soccer practice, they have, volunteer stuff that they're doing at that young of an age. And I think it's becoming more and more ingrained in kids. You have to do everything. And I think especially as women, we kind of feel this call still to prove ourselves and to prove that we have value to contribute. So I see it all the time. I've been a victim of it myself.
And some of it, I guess, by the time you get to high school level is really directed at getting into college.
Yeah, I mean, standing out, because it's not, like I said, it's not enough to just have good grades anymore to get into school. You have to really show that you can do it all. And it translates into young professionals' life. I see, through all the wonderful volunteering organizations that I've been a part of, I also see a lot of my fellow volunteers be really overwhelmed and maybe have to take a step back for a month or two because work is too crazy and they've overcommitted. So I think it's tough. It kind of all comes to a head as we are getting to that point in our careers where we're starting to be comfortable in our careers. We want to push ourselves. We want to have new experiences. But then there's also the tendency, as you said, to overcommit, which can be a totally different struggle. And I've seen many, many people do it. I've done it myself. But I think we're getting a little bit smarter about it.
We're going to give you a pass on that.
Yeah.
Overcommitted. We have another question?
I just wanted to say, in answer to your question, that Leadership Greater Hartford also has a program, a couple of programs, I think, where people can join in and actually get training, specific training to develop them to have the skills and understanding of the needs of corporations and both profit and nonprofit institutions and what they need in actually specifically a board member. And so if you're in the position of looking for board members and for young people who are up and coming and wanting to get involved, I think a lot of them are doing training through Leadership Greater Hartford
That's
as
a
well.
great piece of advice. Anybody else who has a question? Sure.
In World War II, periods of national crises, and even today, national natural disasters spurs volunteer efforts. But how do you seize upon the momentum, after the crisis is past to keep people interested?
I think a lot of it comes down to marketing and communications. These days we're so inundated with messaging. I pop onto Facebook, and because I am involved in a lot of volunteer organizations, I will see just countless sponsored ads for various organizations pop up in my Facebook news feed. And how do you make that choice, right, of where to go? I think once you have volunteers come to your door and you have them there, you have to work to keep them. And one thing that we're finding in our work with ELS is that making a personal connection is so much more valuable than just sending out a canned email, thank you for volunteering at this event. To have someone who's on staff or somebody who's a regular volunteer personally reach out and say, hey, it was great to meet you at this event. I really hope that you found it valuable, that you really learned something, or that you really enjoyed the experience. Here's what we have coming up. Let me know if you want to meet up for coffee, or if you want to grab a drink sometime, we can talk more. Let me learn about you. I think that personal touch more and more is becoming more important versus just kind of sending out a general blast. Once you've gotten all these volunteers, like you said, for natural disasters and things like that, to just a general blast that says, oh, thank you for donating. We'll see you next time there's a disaster, versus actually reaching out, which is terrible, but versus reaching out to say, hey, thank you specifically, and maybe, it's somebody who you volunteered with on site, and I hope that you'll come to our next event. And I think it's something we're finding more and more in this digital age, that personal connection is so much more meaningful than ever because we are so distanced from one another.
I also think, Katie, I think about the kind of volunteering that my mother did, and it was much more generic. It didn't necessarily have anything to do with her skill set, whether she was stuffing envelopes for a hospital fund drive, or whether she was delivering meals from Meals on Wheels, so it wasn't necessarily tied into the fact that she had a master's degree in teaching, she had this and that. And I think today, my impression is that volunteers of all ages today want a volunteer opportunity that really makes use of the skill set that they have.
Yeah, I think we want to feel like we're adding value, like we're really contributing to something. And I think it comes from that drive to prove yourself, sort of that overcommitment that I talked about, to say, look, I can do everything. But I think that when we are spending our time and making that choice to spend time on things, we want to make sure that we're putting our best foot forward and that we truly are adding value. I know for me with Emerging Leader Society, while it's great to, be at a board meeting, or while it's great to be in the classroom, for me, something that I know I'm really passionate about and a skill that I have is marketing and communications, and I don't get to do that on my job. So for me, I feel like I'm adding the most value when I'm doing that, and it makes that time that much more valuable to me because I feel like I'm bringing something unique and really valuable for that organization to the table that they have been in need of.
I think we're about to wrap up, so I want to give each of you an opportunity to make sort of a closing statement, give us a closing thought. And David, I'll start with you. And that my question to you is really if you could sort of encapsulate a little bit about Hartford in World War I and how active this community was, regardless of men, women, what have you.
Well, as I said before, the best way to think about it is it was a total war effort, a total community effort. From the young people, from high school students who made gas masks, to the junior YWCA, the junior Red Cross, the elementary school students who helped with the knitting and the food collection and the food, helped with raising chickens in the yard, and all the way up to the elderly. In fact, one of the YMCA actually became a uniformed division of the American forces, and one of the leaders in France was a guy who was a veteran of the Spanish-American War, and it was like he was too old to serve, but he ends up getting the YMCA and becomes a leader overseas in Hartford's YMCA contingent. So it really touched all age groups, and it was a total, for lack of a better word, pretty much team effort during the course of the war.
Thank you. Heather, sort of a closing thought, if you would, to leave us with regarding what you've been talking about today.
Well, just to touch upon the issue of team effort, when you leave talented individuals off the team or you leave them on the bench, to use a sports metaphor, you really are wasting a lot of human potential. And I think maybe one of the lessons of the story I told is don't underestimate people based on whatever personal prejudices you might carry around. So I don't know how much relevant that is today, but there's so many historical examples of people who could have made a difference, but they weren't allowed to because of prejudice.
I think there's still relevance to that today.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we have some people nodding in the audience, but thank you for that. Katie, what I'd like to ask you really is if you would give us a way to get involved with the Emerging Leader Society. People are watching this program. How can they find out more about it and maybe join you?
Sure, so you can, of course, check out our Facebook page, speaking about social media. That's a great way to sort of stay abreast of the different events that we have going on. Also, our website through United Way, even if you just Google Emerging Leader Society Hartford, it'll bring you right to our page. Our program leader, Rebecca Castano, is fantastic. She's so passionate. She went from being a member to being our program manager because she loves the program that much. So it's a great group of people. We do, as I said, a variety of things. It's an awesome group to be involved with. So definitely, if you're looking for a way to contribute to the community, to meet new people, it's a great way to do that.
Well, thank you so much for representing that organization today, and thank you all three for contributing to this conversation. I just want to remind everybody that David's book is available in our gift shop, and thank all of you for coming today, too. We really appreciate it. Thank you.